June 14, 2200 hours. Coastal Storm Operations Base, North Atlantic Sector. Official logs later recorded that crosswinds had pushed past approved taxi thresholds. Even so, flight activity did not halt. The casualty timeline does not pause for compliance. Floodlights bent under repeated gusts, their beams warping into fractured rings across soaked concrete. Engines wound upward in measured steps. Checklist responses came sharp and clipped, impatience riding every syllable. Radio traffic stacked over itself as rain-hammered helmets slid down visors and crawled beneath aircraft skids. Near the hangar doors, medics arranged stretchers in rows, plastic sheeting snapping and whispering like surf dragged back by the tide. With each minute burned away, the evacuation window narrowed further. Staff Sergeant Mara Dalton stood just outside the movement line, uniform saturated and clinging to her arms. Headset pressed under her elbow to shield it from the rain. Her stance was unreadable, neither tense nor relaxed. She followed fuel cart positions, marshal signals, rotor arcs, not with nerves but with silent calculation. To ground crew cut in front of her and began redirecting activity they did not have authority over. One barked at her to clear the lane so pilots could do their job. The aircraft, being repositioned, was not set up for medevac. Litter brackets were missing. The power distribution checklist would not align with the intended load. But urgency disguises error by dressing it up as necessity. No one stopped long enough to question it. Later reports would reference elevated noise levels, intensifying winds, and a string of minor authorizations approved too fast to be thoughtful. Dalton sensed the mistake forming the way an experienced mechanic hears a bearing fail before it locks. She said quietly, "Nothing." "Not yet," warning tones chirped. Stretcher straps snapped against exposed metal. Rain streaked through floodlight beams like interference. If moments like this remind you why calm decision-making saves lives, stay with us and tell us where you're listening from. Your viewpoint matters, and every salute in the comments honors the professionals who work without applause. Thank you for standing with them. Mara Dalton learned early that storms communicate. They speak through vibration along aircraft skin, through subtle changes in rotor wash, through the way crews accelerate when they should decelerate. She listened the way others pray quietly, without expectation of notice. Most of her days began before the lights warmed the tarmac and ended after everyone else had cleared out. Logs demanded precision. Airframes demanded respect. Helicopters remembered every shortcut taken. In her early 30s, she carried herself with the posture of someone shaped by long hours and longer flights. Not stiff, just grounded. She was the crew chief assigned to storm response, aircraft the machines expected to wake when everything else failed. Her headset bore a permanent crease from being sheltered under her arm through storm after storm. Her boots were theoretically clean, and her hands moved with muscle memory that said practice, not fear. People rarely spoke about her unless they believed she was out of earshot. Most only knew a single version of her story. She had transferred from another base following what had been labeled a minor incident, a phrase that sharpens as it travels. By the time rumors finished their work, the transfer sounded like discipline. No one asked for the truth. It was simpler to assume quiet people attract trouble. Mara never corrected them. She worked. Her logs stayed meticulous. Her tools stayed aligned. Her voice stayed even. She favored precision over explanation. When she spoke, she offered details instead of opinions. That restraint unsettled some. Silence was mistaken for gentleness. Gentleness for weakness. They hadn't learned yet that nothing carries more weight than a voice that never needs to rise. Specialist Jonah Reeves was among the first to meet her after her arrival. Assigned to flight line maintenance, perpetually streaked with grease, always trying to prove his place. His intentions were good. His relationship with rumor was not. When people hinted her transfer meant trouble, he repeated it without malice. Sometimes he brought her tools she hadn't requested, half help, half apology. She thanked him regardless. First Lieutenant Carter Vale moved like confidence had been stamped into him during flight school. New to the base, new to storm ops, already convinced skill and momentum could overcome resistance. He learned quickly and trusted speed. Mara noticed he followed checklists until urgency arrived. He respected her work, but did not yet consider her integral to the mission. In his mental structure, pilots flew, and crews supported clean lines, simple divisions. Helicopters did not honor those distinctions. though it would take him time to learn that Senior Chief Raymond Hill held no such illusions. Enough seasons on coastal stations had burned optimism out of him. Thick hands, deliberate speech, eyes that measured everything. He respected experience and distrusted transfers. In his world, people weren't moved without reason. He watched Mara the way sailors watch a dark horizon, not hostile, not welcoming, waiting to see what pressure revealed. Sergeant Lee Torres ran the medics with orchestral precision, efficient, sharp, immune to charm. She did not dislike Mara. She disliked delay. When patients were bleeding, freezing, or slipping away by the minute, anything slowing launch felt like obstruction. Support crews either helped or interfered. She'd watched too many missions die while arguments about procedures dragged on. That impatience tinted every exchange. The friction never erupted openly. It surfaced sideways. A raised eyebrow when her transfer was mentioned. A casual question about whether she'd ever been on a real mission, as if aircraft under her hands didn't count. More than once, a junior sailor joked about her fixing things while the real work happened in the air. She ignored it. There was always something that needed finishing. What no one noticed was the laminated card tucked inside her chest pocket. Not an ID, not a keepsake. A checklist, handwritten, edges bleached pale by weather. One side held standard storm procedures. The other carried compact notes fuel behavior in crosswinds. Hydraulic quirks tied to specific tail numbers. How litters shifted under turbulence when straps were off by inches. She updated it after every lesson learned the hard way. It wasn't official, so she kept it private. It was a promise to herself. The incident at her previous base had been small. No wreckage. No headlines. An aircraft launched with a subtle imbalance that could have escalated. Mara caught it, insisted on a pause, pushed the report higher than was comfortable. Launch was delayed. The issue corrected. Everyone came back alive. Consequences arrived later as cold shoulders and a transfer wrapped in administrative politeness. It was easier for the system to treat her warning as disruption rather than precedent. Now she occupied that narrow space between essential and underestimated. She signed paperwork, torqued bolts to exact values, then checked them again when no one was watching. She watched pilots square their shoulders before climbing aboard. She watched storm bands creep across radar with the patience of tectonic plates. The role fit, necessary without recognition. On training days, Jonah lingered nearby asking about load calculations and rotor pitch. On mission nights, Vale brushed past with a nod, pulled by adrenaline and briefings. Hill recorded observations and withheld judgment. Torres paced near the ambulance bay, eyes fixed on the clock as if impatience alone could speed rotors. Mara absorbed it all, not control awareness. Helicopters punished assumption. She tracked tools from memory, replayed conversations later for missed signals, built mental maps of who rushed, who hesitated, who cut corners in the name of speed. It wasn't judgment. It was data. Preparation. Another entry, waiting for that, laminated card. There were evenings when wind settled and steam rose from the tarmac like breath. Crews joked, traded stories, planned weekends. Mara sat on an overturned crate and wrote in her log, deliberate and neat. Sometimes she thought about the transfer, about how icily truth folds into something else. Then she filed the thought away. Storms never stayed distant for long. The first alert arrived, garbled, swallowed by static. A trawler in open black water had rolled beneath storm weight, bitten whole by a wave indifferent to maps or authority. A Coast Guard voice mentioned Mayday flares seen once, then gone. The operations bay tightened instantly. Hypothermia negotiated nothing knit, simply counted down. On the screens, outer storm bands crossed the line where safety was assumed to exist. Wind readings jumped beyond briefing figures. Visibility rose and fell like an undecided pulse. Night landings were hard even in calm seas. Tonight, the ocean looked like a hand closing around anything that touched it. Command began cautiously. Assessment. Potential launch. Standby. Then, casualty numbers stabilized. And careful language hardened into orders. The margin for survival narrowed until it was barely a line. A colonel standing at the back of the room ran the numbers in his head distance. Airspeed, exposure time in freezing water, and did not like where they landed. So he did what people in authority often do when reality feels unforgiving. He tried to force time to cooperate. Launch was pulled forward. then pushed forward again. Safety buffers that looked solid in the manuals were quietly redefined. Down on the hangar floor, that decision felt like pressure between the shoulder blades. Checklists that demanded patience faded into background noise. The boundary between urgency and recklessness blurred until it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Mara sensed the shift before it was spoken aloud. It revealed itself in movement. Jonah started jogging instead of walking, dropped a tool tray, left it scattered. Hydraulic carts screamed as they rolled, no one stopping to question the sound. Procedures that normally stacked in clean order began to overlap. Pages were flipped without fingers tracing lines. The noise sharpened. Gaps between actions vanished. Lieutenant Vale emerged from the briefing room with his flight gear, half secured, helmet tucked under his arm, chin strap trailing loose. His jaw was locked, his gaze already fixed beyond the doors, as if determination alone could lift the aircraft. Senior Chief Hill intercepted him, attempting to pin him down for 30 seconds of confirmation on configuration. Vale brushed past with a quick assurance that operations had already cleared it. "The storm is eating our margin," he said. "We have to move." Hill did not accept that. He called operations, voice level but edged. The exchange that followed did not belong on an open floor. Terms like risk envelope and non-standard tolerance crept in. Each sentence consumed seconds. Each second pressed against the skin of men already slipping toward hypothermia. The colonel upstairs cut across the channel and ended the discussion. Proceed. The mission could not absorb another delay. On the flight line, the selected aircraft was towed out and turned nose first into the weather. Jonah rode the tractor, shoulders drawn tight, pretending not to notice Mara watching him. The rain had shifted from falling to striking, driven sideways in hard pellets that slapped against the fuselage. Ground crew in reflective vests signaled through rotor wash, gestures precise even as judgment lagged behind. Inside the hangar bay, the trawler's last known position blinked on a screenless single pulse in a moving field of blue. Fuel trucks arrived in sequence. Mara stepped in automatically to oversee the connections. Storm fueling was never routine. Crosswinds distorted distribution if lines weren't watched carefully, and medevac loads made tail behavior unpredictable. She tracked the gauges as they climbed, listened to the pump cadence, felt the subtle thump through her boots as tanks filled. Something about the pattern resisted settling. She moved closer, tapped the panel, then checked the tail number against the laminated card pressed inside her vest. The configuration on record did not align with the fueling sequence underway. The aircraft was being loaded as if for standard transport, not a littered medevac. With the cabin arranged incorrectly, center of gravity would shift. It might fly. It might fight. The storm would choose. She flagged Jonah first, lifting her voice just enough to break through the wind. He frowned, followed her gesture, and understood immediately. His eyes bounced between gauges, tail assembly, and the checklist on his clipboard. He glanced toward the operations door, where officers moved with purpose. For a moment, it looked like he might step inside and call for a pause. Then his radio cracked, someone snapping about lost time. Jonah flinched, offered Mara a regretful half-smile, and told the fuel crew to complete the sequence. "We'll adjust in flight," he said quietly, borrowing language he'd heard pilots use. Mara started to speak, then stopped. This was not a battle to wage through a specialist. The medical bay inside the aircraft was still being assembled. Stretchers slid into place. Straps threaded hurriedly, sloppiness masked by assumption that corrections would come later. Torres moved between gurneys, counting supplies, checking monitors, snapping at a junior medic for misplacing a thermal pack. She noticed Mara near the ramp, but did not invite her in. Their responsibilities ran parallel until rotor wash forced overlap. Mara stepped toward the ramp anyway, intent on at least reading the layout. Litter angles, oxygen bottle placement, clearance paths in tight quarters while fully geared. Storms did not forgive cramped spaces. One violent jolt could turn unsecured equipment into shrapnel. She reached the ladder base just as Vale climbed, boots leaving wet prints on the rungs. A junior NCO, acting as line marshal, moved instinctively to block her. Palm raised, the gesture reflexive from years of keeping curious bodies away from spinning metal. "Crew only past this point, Staff Sergeant," he said, as if reminding her of a boundary she'd never crossed. She met his eyes, then deliberately glanced at the crew chief patch on her chest. His expression didn't shift. He had already decided how this story worked. Pilots fly. Medics treat. Support clears the way. Too many people near the cockpit slowed things down. The storm was not waiting for one heartbeat. The conflict compressed into that narrow space at the ladder's base. Wind clawed at the hangar doors. Radios spat, clipped call signs. Somewhere offshore, men clung to debris or disappeared beneath waves. Right here, a junior NCO decided the best way to help was to keep the quiet woman with the laminated card out of the conversation. Mara could have asserted rank, quoted procedure, recited the section assigning her responsibility for aircraft readiness, not just cabin order. She could have pulled Hill in and forced the halt. Instead, she stepped back, allowing the NCO's hand to remain raised. Not because he was correct, but because the room already leaned toward confrontation, and friction now would only accelerate a worse outcome. She looked up through the cockpit glass. Vale's silhouette leaned toward the instruments, helmet secured, mouth moving in the cadence of pre-flight calls. She couldn't hear the words over rising engine pitch, but she recognized the rhythm checklist by memory, not paper, efficient, fast, dangerous when paired with missing data at the operations desk. Remaining paperwork was rushed through. A clipboard traveled down the line, pausing at each station. Fuel, maintenance, medical safety. Initials filled boxes like falling dominoes. No one compared medevac requirements against actual cabin configuration. No one cross-checked fueling pattern against storm load. The colonel had already cleared launch. The paper needed to catch up. A safety officer skimmed the forms, saw the correct aircraft designation printed at the top, and signed with tired confidence. He didn't step outside to verify. Weather made outside checks miserable, and he trusted the system. The system trusted urgency. Urgency trusted luck. Mara watched the pen move and felt something settle inside her. The familiar sensation of watching small choices accumulate weight. This was how it always unfolded. Not with a single disastrous call, but with a series of quiet allowances. A corner rounded, a voice ignored. Someone like her left standing at the bottom of a ladder because another person assumed authority followed title alone. She turned away from the cockpit access and walked the length of the fuselage instead, palms sliding along the skin as if balance could be read through touch. The laminated card pressed against her chest with each breath, compressed knowledge no one had asked for. In the distance, lightning flared where the trawler's last signal might have faded. How often, she wondered, did quiet competence get mistaken for irrelevance? On most bases, the answer was simple. As often as it was allowed. Tonight, the cost would not be measured in bruised pride or delayed reports. It would be measured in exposure minutes, in freezing water, in rotor pitch wrestling crosswinds, in the thin difference between a heavy tail and a controlled hover over black seas. Jonah jogged past her again, toward an unsecured tool cart. He hesitated, mouth opening as if to mention the fuel pattern, then closed it. His radio snapped again, sharper this time. Clear the lane. We're behind. He nodded and ran, choosing compliance over the knot in his stomach. Senior Chief Hill stepped out of operations and scanned the line. Eyes narrowed. He caught Mara's look and held it, reading something unspoken. He frowned as if storing it for later. Then the flight deck phone rang, pulling him back inside. Too many fires? Too little time. The rotors began turning slow at first, then faster blades slicing rain into sheets. Into broad, horizontal sheets. Torres boarded with her team, ducking beneath the spinning disc, gear packs slamming against their legs. Inside the cabin, straps still waited for proper tightening. Oxygen lines lay coiled in places where a rushed step could later snag. No one stopped to redo work that had been done in haste. Back in the operations bay, a clipboard received its final marks, the handwriting sharper and more hurried than usual. The aircraft's launch readiness line was checked off. No one would later remember exactly whose initials sealed it. At the time, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt procedural, a minor box ticked on a night already saturated with urgency and fear. On the line, personnel began clearing the area. The junior NCO at the ladder finally lowered his hand and stepped aside, satisfied that access had been controlled. Mara stayed where she was for a heartbeat longer than required, her gaze traveling from fuel ports to landing gear to the navigation lights tracing the fuselage. Wind lashed her face, sound compressing from every direction at once. She did not yell. She did not signal dramatically or attempt to halt the mission with spectacle. She simply cataloged every detail with clinical precision. If the aircraft lifted with the imbalance, she suspected, the margin over that unstable sea would compress to nearly nothing. And if something failed, the storm would erase any distinction between procedure followed and pride defended. Wind never behaves obediently. It slid sideways across the line, threaded itself between machines like a thinking thing, tugging at tarps and banners, worrying anything not secured with intent. Most people felt only chaos in the gusts. Mara read them as guidance. She crossed to the cargo bay where a support crate had been lashed hurriedly, webbing angled wrong for crosswind pressure. Quietly, she loosened the strap, rerouted it, and cinched the tie at a point that would distribute force instead of tearing free. No one noticed. The crate simply stopped rattling. Behind her, someone shouted for spare gloves. A curse followed as a clipboard skidded into standing water. Mara moved on without announcing herself. A rotor cover flapped too close to a vent port. She secured it, added a second fastener, and ensured the tag wouldn't whip loose. Small corrections, each shaving away a fraction of risk. In storms, fractions multiplied faster than anyone liked to acknowledge. In the shadow of the hangar door, she paused long enough to pull out her laminated card. The edges had clouded where salt and rain had chewed at it over years of use. She wiped moisture from its surface with her thumb and traced a note added the previous. Cezanne, a reminder about load shift behavior on this airframe when crosswinds exceeded 30 knots. The writing was small, unofficial, and invaluable. She flipped the card and added another line at the bottom. Medbay offset plus storm equals taillight sensitivity on final. Then she slipped it back into her pocket like contraband. A harried crew chief from another bay sprinted past and asked if the launch path was still clear. Mara studied the tarmac, the placement of marshalling wands, the frantic traffic along the service road. She ran the distance math silently and answered that operations would switch to runway 09 within minutes, not by preference. But because the wind had already turned the base into a funnel, the other chief opened his mouth to argue, then stopped as the gusts shifted again and the tower call confirmed the change. He nodded, grateful, without understanding why, and kept moving. Mara didn't smile. Credit was irrelevant. She returned to the aircraft and leaned into the cabin, rechecking straps that had been threaded backward. Her hands moved unhurriedly, while voices behind her rose into the pitch people use when they believe speed itself will save them. A medic brushed past and knocked a portable monitor off balance. Mara steadied it with her elbow, rotated it to a safer angle, tightened the mount, not her lane officially, but lanes dissolve when metal meets weather. Near the wall, a maintenance checklist lay half-finished, smeared by wet gloves. The missing entries weren't disastrous alone. She picked up the pen, rewrote the relevant line, and added initials she knew would pass audit without falsifying reality. She wrote slowly, deliberately, as if the base weren't groaning under urgency. Panic narrows vision. Slowing down is sometimes the fastest route through. A few yards away, Vale climbed down briefly to confer with Hill. The exchange was short, more collision than conversation. Hill wanted final verification on load. Vale wanted lift before the next squall swallowed their window. They parted unresolved. Vale noticed Mara at the maintenance board and for a split second looked as if he might ask her opinion. Then someone shouted his call sign and the moment dissolved. He jogged back to the ladder, never aware of the subtle corrections already made around his aircraft. Rain surged, then eased, testing resolve. Mara wiped her hands on her pant leg and scanned the line again. A loose cable coil lay where someone could trip in the dark. She tightened it, hung it properly. The wind moaned through the hangar ribs, announcing the approaching squall. She adjusted one last tie, secured another latch, and stepped clear just as a gust tore through, shaking everything not anchored with intention. Her laminated card peeked from her pocket, a small rectangle of stubborn calm in a world tipping toward noise. She tapped it twice, not for luck, but for memory. Procedures live in manuals. Lessons live in scars and handwriting. She trusted the one she could trace. No one asked what she was thinking. No one noticed why the straps she touched stayed quiet while others sang under strain. From a distance, she looked like any crew chief hovering, tidying, preventing obvious failure. The truth was deeper. layered in an understanding of how small variables behaved when wind, water, and human haste collided. Across the base, the tower crackled over the net, announcing the shift to runway 09 exactly as she had predicted. Some blinked in surprise. Others swore and rerouted traffic. Mara adjusted her internal map and kept moving. She stepped aside as Torres emerged briefly to argue for additional warming. Pax. She nodded to Jonah, whose eyes held a question he couldn't yet name. She watched Vale strap in and settle into the cockpit like someone stepping into a fast river. If the tension had a name, it wasn't drama. It was the quiet certainty that pieces were being placed in the wrong order, and the awareness of the one person who could see the pattern forming, saying nothing yet, correcting what lay within reach. The shift from ground noise to engine rhythm is usually gradual, a negotiation between machine and weather. Tonight, it skipped straight to confrontation. As turbines spooled, the storm leaned closer, curious and hostile. Blades shredded rain into roaring walls. Numbers bloomed across cockpit displays, green lines climbing toward. Normal dot, then one faltered. A hydraulic pressure indicator flickered. Dipped, recovered, dipped again. Not enough to scream, just enough to whisper caution. Vale saw it and tapped the bezel with familiar irritation. The shared dialect of pilots everywhere, dealing with temperamental sensors. Weather does that, he told himself. Give it a moment, he continued. In the cabin, Torres braced as vibrations shifted. Her focus stayed on medkits and warming blankets, not forward panels. She barely registered the brief yellow light before it disappeared. Outside, the line marshal snapped his wand, signaling clear. Jonah raised a thumbs up from the rear quarter, relieved the aircraft was waking as expected. Mara didn't watch the cockpit first. She watched the tail. Storm turbulence plays strange games with pressure systems, especially when paired with uneven loading and an airframe never meant for this configuration. She felt more than heard a delayed response as torque increased, the kind of lag that could turn violent once airborne. The laminated card might as well have burned against her chest. The warning flickered again. Someone shouted they were committed. Another voice stressed time. Fishermen were freezing. Every minute counted. No one was reckless. They had simply chosen which risk to accept, and they had decided the sensor was wrong. Mara stepped forward. The line marshal moved to block her by reflex, but she was already past him, driven by a decision made long before words caught up. She reached the crew access point and struck the fuselage twice hard enough to cut through storm and engines. Hard enough to reach the cockpit. Vale's head snapped toward her. Through the glass, he saw her face, and something there unsettled him. She gave the universal signal for shutdown. Not wait, not check. Stop, dot. The cockpit froze for half a heartbeat, then erupted with overlapping objections. They were spooled, cleared, already late. Hill's voice cut in, sharp and incredulous, demanding to know what was happening on the ramp. The junior NCO surged forward, anger tightening his posture. You didn't abort a launch out here without a reason carved in stone. Mara met Vale's eyes and shook her head once. He hesitated, suspended between procedure and the unmistakable clarity in her expression. The hydraulic warning flickered again longer this time, undeniable before fading. Vale swore, low and tight. He looked at his co-pilot, then back to the instrument panel, then through the glass to Mara, and finally made the decision that would later be parsed in conference rooms and after-action reports. He terminated the sequence. The engine spooled down with an irritated whine. Outside, the storm seemed insulted by the hesitation around the aircraft. Bodies locked into a stillness heavier than motion. Anger rolled down the line like a second weather system. Torres yanked off one glove and leaned out from the cabin, disbelief sharpening her voice. Jonah went pale, the kind of pale that suggested nausea more than fear. 3 layers of headset carried the colonel's demand for an explanation. Mara didn't raise her voice. She didn't mirror the tension. She climbed one step up the access ladder and spoke into the open air, each sentence landing clean and deliberate, like tools laid out on steel. This isn't a sensor glitch. Hydraulic pressure is unstable because the storm is forcing micro-corrections faster than the system can equalize. With this fuel distribution and the med bay configured as it is, your tail will lag under torque at lift. If the crosswind hits during that lag, you'll yaw into a condition you can't recover from at low altitude. There was no accusation, no drama, just physics, numbers, and the steady resolve of someone unwilling to wager other people's lives. Silence followed. Even the colonel stopped speaking, recalculating without wanting to acknowledge that he was recalculating. Hill appeared at the base of the ramp, breathing hard as if he'd run. His eyes moved from Mara to the tail to the windsock, snapping sideways like a tethered animal. Vale stared again at the indicator, now dark, calm, and deceptive. "Explain the fix," Hill said. Mara did, using the same tone someone might use to recite groceries. "Rebalance fuel to a medevac center of gravity profile. Reorient litters along a corrected axis to compensate for storm-induced roll. Reset a hydraulic sensor that had been reconnected too quickly during preload and never locked fully. Reset stabilization. Logic. Rerun startup slowly." Someone argued it would cost another 6 or 7 minutes. Mara nodded. It would. Losing the aircraft would cost everything. Mara met the frustration directly, without flinching. "They'll have fewer if we crash on approach." Hill made the call with a sound halfway between resignation and respect. "Do it," he said. "Move." The frozen fury broke into motion. But this time the movement had direction. Not forward at any cost, forward through correction. Mara stepped down and went straight to the hydraulic panel. Her gloves worked with practiced certainty, reseating the sensor until it clicked home. She traced the line visually, checking for kinks or rub points that could cause trouble later. She pulled Jonah in and directed the fuel rebalance. Standing beside him at the gauges, instead of shouting from across the line, his face stayed pale, but he listened and followed, even when it contradicted what he'd been told earlier. Numbers slid into safer ranges. The tail settled, no longer acting like an unanswered question. Inside the cabin, Mara moved between litters and equipment, shifting orientations by inches. Torres watched, scowl loosening as straps fell silent and loose items found stability. Mara explained nothing unless asked. She tightened, rethreaded, repositioned, then nodded. That was enough. At the cockpit, Vale leaned out again. "Where's my assigned crew chief?" Irritation bled into the question. Hill answered before Mara could, grounded on the far side of the base. "Weather closed his taxi lane? He won't make it." Vale cursed. He needed someone who knew this aircraft completely. Someone who had just stopped it from becoming an example. His eyes flicked to Mara before he could stop them. "I'll crew it," she said. No bravado, no claim. Just capability stated. The junior NCO who'd blocked her earlier looked ready to object, but Hill cut him off. "Works for me. She knows this bird." The colonel gave a clipped authorization over the net and shifted focus back to coastal coordination. Time pressed again, but now it felt like an ally, not an enemy, because it was being used correctly, cross-checked corrected values against the laminated card and the live readings, and took her station. Vale ran startup again, slower, every call acknowledged and confirmed. The hydraulic indicator climbed and held. Instruments settled into a rhythm like a body finally breathing evenly. The wind didn't soften, but it stopped feeling underestimated. The line marshal signaled clear. Jonah stepped back, eyes lingering on Mara with something new layered beneath concerned gratitude. The aircraft flexed, shifted, then steadied exactly where it should. Vale eased it off the pad with care, hands light, treating the helicopter like a living thing that needed guidance, not force. The tail responded cleanly. "You're held," the storm protested, but the machine answered with steady refusal. Respect didn't arrive as applause. It appeared in silence, in the way no one questioned Mara's place anymore. In Vale's quiet intercom call, "Crew chief," confirmed tail behavior and the fact that he waited for her answer before committing forward. In Torres's wordless nod as she braced in the back, trusting the aircraft in a way she hadn't 10 minutes earlier, they lifted into the night, not as a gamble, but as a deliberate act of competence shaped by someone who refused to let urgency pretend it was wisdom by midway to the grid. The storm reinvented itself. The cell pivoted without warning and slammed the helicopter sideways. Straps tugged. Muscles screamed. Old injuries woke up. Vale corrected, then overcorrected by a breath. The aircraft rolled, settled, rolled again, testing him like a river tests stone. Mara watched the horizon, not the instruments. Instruments lag? Storms don't. She felt the rhythm tempo. Pressure Ant spoke into the intercom with the same calm precision she'd used on the ramp. Crosswind building at your 3. Ease the left pedal half an inch. Let the tail breathe. Their veil followed. Jaw tight. The aircraft responded as if relieved to be led instead of fought. Another gust hit. The nose dipped. Hold your hover point, Mara said softly. Don't chase the wind. Make it chase you. Small corrections. He made them. The helicopter steadied. Torres set a gloved hand on the litter rail, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with something like reluctant faith. They worked the search pattern, descending to inspect debris, climbing to reset each movement, carrying the weight of the earlier choice. They were airborne because someone had refused to let the wrong configuration fly. On return, the storm still owned the sky. Vale brought them in with the wary respect of someone who knows the ground can be the most dangerous obstacle. Crosswinds cut across the runway exactly as Mara had forecast hours earlier. He began descent, felt tail drag, nearly called abort. You've got it, Mara said. Trust the weight shift. Ride the wind. He breathed once and did. The helicopter touched down with more grace than the night deserved. Engines wound down like an argument finally exhausted. Figures emerged from rain and shadow. Medics offloaded what they'd recovered. Maintenance secured blades. Hill nodded once from a distance, mostly to himself. Vale climbed out, legs unsteady, and looked back at the aircraft as if seeing it for the first time. That was when Colonel Adrian Ross stepped onto the line. He wasn't theatrical. He carried the storm like another insignia, eyes cataloging everything without effort. He spoke briefly with Vale about approach vectors and crosswind management. Thanked Torres for keeping her team steady. He used the right words sparingly. Then he turned to Mara. Nearby conversations dimmed, as if the air itself recognized the shift. Ross studied her not, searching but confirming. He had read her file. He had read the incident reports others had chosen to interpret differently. He had noticed how a woman who stayed quiet kept appearing at the comm center of missions that didn't end badly. One of the junior NCOs began to speak, perhaps to frame her actions as luck or routine maintenance. Ross raised a single finger, and whatever explanation the man had been preparing collapsed in his throat. Staff Sergeant Dalton, he said evenly. Not crew. Her name, exact and deliberate. He let the silence sit just long enough to give it weight, then nodded, once measured, respectful, without embellishment. Dalton, well done. There was no applause, no speech followed. The storm still screamed beyond the floodlights, unconcerned with ranks or recognition. But the force of that acknowledgement settled into every set of eyes that had doubted her. It didn't change who she was. It simply made the truth visible. That was the only kind that mattered. The earlier sortie had bought them information and minutes. The final extraction would decide whether the men clinging to wreckage would ever see daylight again. The storm, offended by their refusal to quit, gathered itself and smashed the sea into jagged slabs. Debris spun in slow, brutal circles like broken planets. The flares burned low, as if wary of drawing attention. Vale brought the helicopter over the last viable cluster of survivors. Even with floodlights, the water below looked like absence in motion. The winch operator braced. Torres crouched at the door with blankets ready, jaw locked. Mara stood at her station, watching everything the way the wind pressed against the rotor disc. The timing of the surges beneath shattered hull fragments, the way Vale's shoulders betrayed doubt a split second before his voice ever could. He eased into hover. The crosswind shifted. The tail twitched. Vale started to chase it, realized the balance was slipping, and his world narrowed to a sharp beat of panic. The radio filled with overlapping instructions from the command boat. Someone shouted about losing another man. Vale's breathing came fast over the intercom. Mara stepped forward into the narrow space between chaos and control, the way one steps into a river, not to take the aircraft, but to give the moment structure. You fly attitude. I'll call the wind. He hesitated. Not from fear of failure, but from knowing there was no margin left. That hesitation the second, where hands hover instead of act can kill. The helicopter tipped a fraction too far. The winch operator swore. 3-second surge cycles. Wait now, ease forward half a foot. Hold crosswind at year 2. Let it slide, don't correct yet. Now, Vale followed the cadence, trusting something other than adrenaline for the first time that night. The aircraft answered with a subtle shift, cooperation spreading through its frame like relief. The tail aligned with the wind instead of fighting it. The hover stabilized. The rescue swimmer clipped into the first survivor. The hoist line tightened. The aircraft dipped just enough to test them. Mara anticipated it before the instruments caught up, calling out weight shifts and counterbalances, like a language only she and the machine shared. Torres glanced from the open door to Mara and back again, silently reworking assumptions she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. There was no heroics here, no bravado, just precise responses where mistakes translate directly into human cost. One survivor cleared the rail, then another. The wind clawed back. Vale stiffened. Mara lowered her voice further, making calm contagious. Breathe. Small inputs, hold, let it pass. 1, 2, now. The nose dipped and rose again, lining up almost perfectly with the invisible corridor she'd already mapped. The swimmer signaled for the last man, barely holding on to a piece of wreckage. Timing became everything again. The sea surged. The cable swayed. Force would fail here. Mara watched the pattern, felt it, and gave the call that mattered. Winch in slow Vale, commit to hover. Don't chase the bow wave. Let it come to you. He did. They did. The last survivor rose through spray that shattered like glass. Torres and the medics hauled him inside, hands fast. Movements sure, blankets wrapped, vitals checked. A small sound escaped the man's throat. Not thanks. Just shock giving way to breath. Then it was done. They climbed out of the extraction zone through turbulence that felt less hostile. No, not because the storm had softened, but because they weren't fighting the aircraft anymore. They were working with it, and with the woman who understood its limits better than anyone on board had realized. No one said anything dramatic. Vale exhaled a long, uneven breath and flew the rest of the route like a man who had just learned the difference between control and mastery. Back on the pad, engines winding down for the last time, Torres stepped out and met Mara's eyes. There was no apologetics, rarely apologize for skepticism, but there was recognition. A quiet acceptance that expertise isn't loud, and that tonight it had worn rain-soaked sleeves and carried a laminated card instead of a stethoscope. Respect didn't arrive as ceremony. It arrived as recalibration. The way Vale waited for Mara's nod before unstrapping. The way Jonah moved around her differently. The way Hill's posture softened when she spoke. The storm still raged beyond the perimeter. But inside the circle of light, the hierarchy had shifted in a way everyone felt, even if no one named it. By morning, the base looked chewed up. Puddles pooled where concrete sagged. Tarps hung crooked. Straps cut fresh grooves into paint. People moved slower, as if the storm had left weight behind. The fishermen were alive, wrapped in hospital blankets and stunned. Quiet-hand reports began their crawl through some read differently than usual. A safety memo circulated by midshift, carefully worded, citing timely intervention, procedural recalibration under adverse weather, and the value of configuration verification even under compressed timelines. It didn't name Mara at first, they rarely do, but anyone who'd been on the ramp knew. By afternoon, a revised version added recommended best practice, and the loudest critics from the night before forwarded it. Without comment, the rumors about her transfer didn't collapse loudly. They just stopped finding air. What once sounded like punishment now felt lazy. Someone remembered the phrase prevented potential mishap from her old report. Someone else remembered how she hadn't tried to decorate it. Eventually, gossip found something easier to feed on. Competence starves rumor. Once it's witnessed, Mara skipped the meetings. She cleaned her tools, replaced a gasket on an unrelated bird, and logged maintenance notes in the same neat handwriting as always. On the edge of her laminated card, she added a final line. Crosswind coaching helps pilots hear the aircraft. She smiled, then tucked the card away. Hill stopped by long enough to say, "Good work," and pretended inventory was the reason. Vale passed her on the way to briefing and paused not for a speech, just a nod heavy with a recalibrated understanding. Torres dropped spare blankets nearby and said, without looking at her, "Next time you see something like that, it faster." It was as close to thanks as she gave. The storm moved on. The base returned to rhythm.fuel, parts, checklists, cold coffee. Mara finished her shift, washed her hands, and moved on to the next quiet task, waiting for her. Some truths don't announce themselves. They settle in like habit, like earned respect. True authority doesn't shout. It shows up when it matters. Most turning points don't come with applause. They happen in quiet corners, in split seconds, in the calm voice that steadies everyone else. I'm curious about you. Was there a time you were underestimated and didn't argue, just did the work and let the truth speak? Share it respectfully so others can learn. If this story meant something to you, stay with the channel and help it grow. Your presence matters more than any algorithm. And if you want more stories that honor discipline, courage, and quiet competence, join us for the next one. This story is fictional, created for entertainment and reflection, inspired by real military values and service culture.